Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am happy to bring the conversation I had with Natalie Foster. Natalie is president and co-founder of the Economic Security Project and a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute Future of Work Initiative. Previously, she was the CEO and co-founder of Rebuild a Dream, a platform for people-driven economic change with Van Jones. She also was the digital director for President Obama's Organizing for America and Democratic National Committee. She was the first head of the digital department at the Sierra Club, deputy organizing director for MoveOn.org. She's had fellowships from the Institute for the Future, Rockwood Leadership Institute, New America, California, and many other wonderful things that she is doing to try and tell people about the guarantee. She has a book out on this, which is called The Guarantee: Inside the Fight for America's Next Economy, and that's what we talk about. We start by talking about what is the guarantee, why government involvement is essential. We do a little bit of a march through history. We talk about FDR a little bit, basic rights. We talk about the rise of neoliberal and neoconservative policies. Talk about the features of the guarantee over the past 15 years. There's about, I believe, 7 categories. So we talk about, people that try to have a guarantee for healthcare, for education, for retirement, living wage, things of this nature. Really where economics just kind of hit us in all aspects of our life. We talk about the importance of community organizing, the Great Recession and the bank bailouts and how that was such a turning point, 2008, 2009. Talk about the rise of right-wing and left-wing populism and how they provided or tried to provide answers for some of the economic challenges. Talk about the debt and inflation, the Affordable Care Act, and the future of the guarantee framework, what that looks like, regardless of who's president of the United States or what administration's there, and how we keep trying our best to make sure that people have economic guarantees and can have just really good lives here in the U.S. and then expanding that globally. So she was such a delight. I love her enthusiasm. I love her hard work on the ground, work that she's doing, how she's trying to really get these things going. She's already done so much wonderful work and continues to do that. So really just such a wonderful time talking with her. I greatly enjoyed it. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. Like, subscribe, follow, share with your friends, contribute, all those wonderful things that I greatly appreciate. And now I bring you Natalie Foster. I am here with Natalie Foster. Natalie, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
It's my honor. Thanks for having me.
No, yeah, absolutely. You've written a marvelous book. It's called The Guarantee: Inside the Fight for America's Next Economy. And that's what we're going to talk about. It was kind of, I felt like I jumped in a time machine going back to 2011 and 16 and 20. It went back to the Obama years. It was really interesting kind of going through the book. So we'll get all into it. Before we do, just tell listeners who you are kind of professionally and what you're currently doing.
I'd love to. I am the president and co-founder of the Economic Security Project. We are a nonprofit that works to build economic power for everyday Americans, regardless of race, religion, zip code. And I'm also a fellow at the Aspen Institute Future of Work Initiative. I'm a mom of 2 kids based out of Oakland, California, and have been an organizer for most of my life. So that's me in a nutshell.
Oh, that's very, very nice. That's great. That's anytime somebody has the title president, it's always super cool, I think. And Aspen's pretty good. So yeah, you've really, really kind of carved out a space for yourself, which is nice. You're doing good work, and you talk a lot about it in the book, which is really, really nice.
Well, thanks. I mean, I don't get to talk on the regular to people about ideas and books like you do, but I do feel excited about my work day to day.
Of course, as you should. Yeah.
If I wasn't doing this, I would want your podcast.
Oh, that's very nice of you. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's nice to. I always tell guests and people that ask me, my agenda is whatever the guest's agenda is. That's usually how I go about it. So I'm always trying to kind of, pour into what they're into for, that hour, 2, 3 hours, however long I have them. So, yeah. So, okay, the guarantee.
Yeah.
You talk about this framework that is the guarantee. And I guess the first question I'm going to ask here is, why, you can explain what that is, but why do you feel, or why do you, kind of know, I guess, why it's the government, the federal government or national government, that should ensure basic needs of all Americans? Why not people do this more, in communities or more autonomously? Or not that they can't do that, but you do emphasize government involvement. And I fully agree with you, but I want to know, I don't want to just sit here and be like, yeah, me too, I agree, yeah, that's cool. So I want to know kind of the case for why it should be government there.
I think it's a yes and to the dichotomy you set up, right, between government and civil society or mutual aid or communities taking care of one another. There's no doubt that is important. And that's actually what makes the fabric rich in society, is people being connected to one another. But I think that is even more possible when we are not working hand to mouth, when we are not working 2 to 3 jobs to put food on the table, when all our time isn't sucked up into just making sure we have the basic needs for ourselves and our family. That if the basic needs are met, there's more time for the relationships and the community that makes life rich and worth living.
You mentioned that there are guarantees in society already. You talk about, a mortgage and marriage, and these are examples. I guess more abstractly, is it possible, right? So when I think about it in terms of there are 3 countries that are the most populous in the world. Goes China, India, that are always kind of competing for number 1, number 2, 1.3, 1.4 billion each. And then there's us, right? And we have 330 some million. India and China do things a little bit differently in terms of their government structures. Do we have too many basic needs? Is it attainable for that many people? Like, a house, a job that gives us a livable wage, healthcare that's, good, doesn't be perfect, but good and can do things. When you start thinking about that for that many people, I think many people look to other countries that are 5 million, 10 million, maybe even 40 million, but it's okay. That's a little bit easier in some ways not. But do we have too many basic needs that government could kind of give that kind of guarantee? Or what makes you feel optimistic that could happen?
I think we absolutely can guarantee basic needs in this country, and that should be what the goal of this multiracial democracy that we are trying to build, which, by the way, has never existed anywhere on earth, should be. The goal should be to have a floor so that everyone can build lives of dignity. And I do think it's possible. And I actually think we're closer than we've ever been before in many ways, because there are a lot of policies that have passed and a news story that says government has a role in doing this. And, to your point about size, part of the reason I think it needs to be the federal government is because the federal government is the ultimate arbiter of scale. A patchwork set of solutions across this country will only get us so far. It's only when the federal government steps in are we able to truly scale solutions that work. Solutions like Social Security, which once was a radical idea that was fought for by a number of clubs called the Townsend Clubs that spread and replicated all over this country long before WhatsApp and Signal existed. And it would, start small when FDR created it, and it would grow and grow over time, becoming a bedrock of what we can guarantee in this country. And so that is where I think we should aim our sights for the next 50 years.
Yeah, you mentioned it in the book. It was nice that you mentioned it, actually. You don't hear people, not too many people talk about it, at least kind of in popular media, as FDR, and right, starting at the at the start of his fourth term, he died shortly after he was elected. He had a second Bill of Rights, which has a lot of the things we want, kind of universal health care, kind of universal good education. There's many things that were in there. Never came really to fruition here in the United States. I guess we see, you mentioned this, that throughout, really throughout the late 60s and then 70s and 80s and early 90s, we see this converging of sorts of people in different political groups starting to have neocon and neoliberal policies, right? So people are sort of trying to take a sort of middle way. They're trying to maybe not be as idealistic or dream as big, and trying to kind of have a hybrid of things. And there are, I mean, Bill Clinton's been told he's a neoliberal. So has, President Obama. People have been, and there's plenty of, I think people have said Bush was a neocon. Like, people have these, almost use it as a kind of, an insult of sorts. How, you don't have to give the history lesson here, but what was appealing about those things for a while? And how do we realize, maybe not quite enough? Maybe it's not quite what we need. What's the kind of story here on this?
Well, you rooted us in FDR with your last question, which I think is noteworthy, because it is easy to forget that there was a period of time in this country where government played a role in ensuring people had a job, pulling us out of the Great Depression, stabilizing society, essentially building the middle class. Now, it left a lot of people out. It left Black Americans and people of color out, and it would further widen the racial wealth gap while doing things like, for my family, my white family, my grandfather would go have the GI Bill be a part of his life after serving. He would start a small business with loans that were very low cost. And my aunt would go to college basically for free on some of these programs. It was very important to my family. It was very important to many families, but it wasn't perfect, which I think is important to name, because I do think we can do it again in the multiracial context in which we live. That said, there was a period where people, I kind of trace it back to the Mont Pelerin Society, who started meeting in, I think, 1947. And it was a group of people who felt like government was intruding in their lives and they wanted more freedom. And they were defining freedom as the ability to do, what they want and make more money than they could. They were. And so they wrote this statement of aims that laid out neoliberal principles and thinking, saying essentially total faith in the market, zero faith in government, and a story of self-reliance, that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And that would become the dominant story. They would plant the seeds in academia, in journalism, in the court system. And with the election of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, you saw these ideas come squarely into the policy realm and become the reigning orthodoxy that we would have for the last 45 to 50 years. You can call it trickle-down economics. You can call it neoliberalism. Call it what you will. It was the way both sides of the party governed for a long period of time. And I believe we're in a new era with a new story, which we can get into shortly. But that's sort of how I think about the rise of neoliberal thinking and trickle-down economics and what it did to our society.
Yeah, I totally agree there. And, even if I take a charitable view of that, okay, fine. We essentially, although there's something to be said about the differences between H.W. Bush and Reagan as presidents, but that aside, we tried that for 12 years. And I still don't understand. I mean, maybe you hear a bit less of it now, but why some people have this kind of fascination with this time as if it was amazing for everybody. Sure, maybe you could say it wasn't all bad for 12 years, but why can we say, here's what works at the very least, whatever that may be, and here's what doesn't? And on the average, didn't really work for a lot of people. And I don't understand why people have this kind of fascination of trying to say, let's go back to that. I never quite understand that. Second to that, we see Plenty of other countries, bigger, smaller, I mean, maybe due to globalization or other things, multi-ethnic, that have a stronger emphasis on government and giving some guarantees, and things are fine. Like I don't understand why people have a kind of, I don't know if the United States wants to always just be different just because or whatever, or to only look at the problems that some of those things have, but other places can do this. Other countries can do this. Like this is in the modern age, and this isn't, something that I don't think the U.S. couldn't do. And sure, maybe we do it in our own way, but I don't know. What do you think it is? This kind of resistance to governments generally, and then this kind of fascination some people have with, the glory years of the '80s and early '90s. What do you think is this kind of thing there? What's going on?
Well, one, I think the consensus is in that trickle-down economics did not spread the gains of the economy widely at all. It concentrated it into the hands of a few people. So I can imagine that those few people really loved that period of time. But broadly, it left our democracy brittle. It left people stressed out, overworked, tired, and unable to make ends meet. We live in a moment in time where 25% of Americans have nothing, zero, saved for retirement. Mm-hmm. We live in a moment in time when 4 out of 10 Americans cannot pull together $400 in an emergency, right? People are living in precarious moments, and yet the economic indicators are doing very well. The market is doing well. GDP is up, and it is just very important to, we've built an economy that is not focused on widespread prosperity. And so it's hard to measure. And therefore all the hand wringing about, why the vibe session? Why are people unhappy with the economy? People are unhappy with the last 50 years of economic policymaking. That's what they're unhappy with. Now, the other thing I'll say is that despite the story we've been told, guarantees do exist for businesses in this country. There are guarantees of patents and court systems and shareholder liability that says you're not personally responsible for corporate, malfeasance. There are all kinds of guarantees that allow businesses to thrive in this country. And so I'm merely arguing we should extend them for the everyday people that make this economy works. So despite the story, government has always been involved. It's just been involved to make things stable for business. So we know it can work. Let's just be clear, be honest about what's happening this and extend our story to a new moment.
Yeah, there's something that you mentioned there kind of along those lines of, you kind of give these 3 myths. Some of them we've kind of already mentioned, but just to kind of put a fine point in it, is that the free market's infallible. I kind of laughed when I read that. I like the free market. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to talk shit about it. But I mean, people do kind of see it as like this kind of religious idea almost. Like it's imperfect. It's infallible. The government's inept, and I mean, I'll be totally fair on some of that. Yeah, there's waste in government. Yeah, there is a lot of difficulties. It does go super slow. There isn't always the best productivity. But I had a conversation with, I'm drawing a blank. My goodness. It was Chris Liddell. Yeah, sorry, I was drawing a blank. Chris Liddell. The best of us. Yeah, he was in the transition phases of the past couple of administrations, Trump administration, Biden administration, and he even worked on the Romney transition, even though that didn't happen. And I think he's kind of in the conservative, maybe libertarian kind of camp, kind of personally. But either way, his book and what he kind of talks about and works with is how to fill government. Like even somebody that's a conservative kind of philosophically is saying like, we need government, obviously, and we need efficient government. And it's huge, right? If people go back and listen to that conversation, you get a kind of, just for like presidential transitions and even for filling the Oval Office. And then that doesn't even get into like State Department, all the departments. it's massive. Like it's a job in itself to fill government positions. And some people may ask, like, well, that's crazy. Why do we need to do all that? And then what you see over time, I mean, we kind of go through this in the history, is something happens, we create a new agency because that makes sense. You need to do that. Your country's expanding, you need to create that. One example is, we created a Department of Homeland Security. That was really important to do after 9/11. And, we still have that today, and how that merges with other agencies. So when you think about like government, it's like, yeah, it's inept in some ways, but it's super necessary. And then the third myth that you talk about is responsibility on the individual. And, some people will say like, well, Natalie, this is nice to say and all this stuff. But if we give it too much of a guarantee, people are going to become lazy. They're not going to work. They're just going to let government, help them, all these kind of tired arguments. So how do you kind of just the snapshot here of how you answer some of these myths?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we're clear that the evidence is in. When we invest in families, they are able to find full-time work at higher rates, and they're able to take a risk and be entrepreneurial in ways that you're not when you're working 2 or 3 jobs. So I think that's just like one way to start the conversation. But you're zooming out more broadly, right? It's like, how do we deal with the old story, right? The government, total faith in the market and zero faith in government. And I think that one is starting to recognize government does play a role. You pointed to Chris. I would also point to Orrin Cass, who put out some interesting polling recently from American Compass, saying that actually there's a lot of people right of center who do think things like Medicaid and Medicare are very important in their lives, who want government to take care of basic needs so that there can be this freedom, frankly, a place I think we can come together and agree. We might have different definitions of freedom, but freedom to spend time with the people you love, freedom to be in community, those things are not possible if you are living hand to mouth. So I do think there is a new story starting to emerge from unlikely allies.
Yeah, I think that it's always a tough thing, and I think that there's these things of like you can people right of center, even left of center can look at this, but a lot of the times some of these things can take kind of you do need to kind of think big, right? Sometimes people get upset with moderates or centrists for going too slow, and that's totally fair. But sometimes it can get too unruly as well. So this is the whole point of democracy and trying to make it happen. And sometimes you'll get what you want, sometimes you won't. But I think those types of things of just speaking honestly about those things is what's important. And most people, I don't know, sometimes the conversation, the rhetoric is too charged for me in some ways. So
Yeah.
You go through, so you have a couple of big chapters, right? So you have a chapter that covers 2011 to 2016. You have another chapter that covers 2016 to 2020, and another chapter that covers 2020 to 2022. So we'll go over those.
History.
Ancient. Well, 2011 felt like ancient history. I'll tell you that much. I was like, oh man, the iPad had just come out. Like, it does kind of feel kind of old now. But I do want to talk about each of these periods, maybe a little bit more recently, because 23, 24. I mean, we're halfway through 24 almost, and there has been a lot of things that have happened. But I guess, why did you decide? Okay, well, why was 2011 a starting point? That's number one. And why did you kind of have these basically big 3 chapters, and in each one you basically cover a variety of things, such as the housing market, such as college and education, especially higher ed. You also talk about healthcare, family care, inheritance, jobs, et cetera. The assumption is that you were trying to kind of hone in on the elements of the guarantee framework, right? Like, these are the things people should have as a guarantee. But I guess why, did you start in 2011 and kind of break it up that way? And how do you see kind of how the guarantee framework that you're describing, how did that look in this kind of first block, second block, and the kind of current third block that we're in?
Well, I sat down to write this. I collaborated with Ariana Conrad, who is a book doula, which I love that title. And she helps people who have ideas like birth books. So we have lots of conversations in the beginning. And, ultimately we're laying out the idea of the guarantee economy with the premise, right, that we should guarantee the basic rights. So we chose 7, which really I give credit to Solana Rice of Liberation and a Generation, who after long walks in Oakland is where we kind of crafted those 7. So you named most of them: healthcare, housing, education, and inheritance, which is an interesting one, colloquially known as baby bonds. And I track each of those 7 across 3 presidential administrations because I frankly was amazed at how much progress each of these guarantees made as they moved into the political mainstream. And then when the pandemic hit, there were glimmers of each of these that happened at the federal level, which we can talk about. And I sort of point to that all as proof of concept that this is no longer pie in the sky, that these ideas are doable right here in the United States, and frankly might be a requirement for our democracy to continue. So we sat down and decided, let's do this Game of Thrones style, right? So instead of doing a chapter on family care and walking you through Ai-jen Poo and her organizing work with domestic workers, starting, in New York, growing across the nation, passing bills of rights, all of which would lead to the idea that care is infrastructure that must be invested in, just like roads and bridges in this country, that it is work that enables other work to happen. And you get to see the progress. Instead of, telling you that story, I thought, let's show how there's similarities and differences between each of these guarantees. And frankly, there were more similarities than there were differences as you trace these across 3 presidential administrations and start to see, the trail that was laid to result in the mainstream policy that we would see.
I'm curious about that. You're talking about the progress that continuously was made throughout the 3 administrations over the past, 13 years now, 15 years, whatever it's been. What do you think is animating that, right? Because it can't just be purely political. It can't just be purely policy. It can't just be, you might say different, but I don't think it's just community organizing or those types of things. Although I think all of those things are a part of it. But it seems like there's almost like another kind of force. Is there kind of like I guess this is a sociological question. Do you feel like there's like a cultural shift, right, in thinking about these things, right? Where it's like, okay, maybe during the 2000s, we were, thinking about 2 wars and terrorism. And I mean, that's fair, kind of post 9/11. But then kind of coming out of that and, obviously with the election of President Obama and things like that, we started to say, okay, and you had a lot of young people energized, that there was a kind of cultural shift there. What do you make about this kind of, that's not to say it's all, green lights all the way up till right now, right? There's definitely some, start, stop. But that more or less, if you look at trend lines, it does seem to have a progressive push as we keep moving further in a technological digital age. So what do you think is kind of animating that, regardless of who's in office, regardless of what policies or bills are getting passed? What's kind of transcending that?
A clear understanding that this trickle-down economy of the last 45 years didn't work for most people. And I would actually date that. I think you're right to name its many forces, undoubtedly. I walk through some of them in the book, but even in conversations since the book's been out into the world, it's been great to hear other people adding on to what they think, created the conditions for the progress that we do see. But I would argue 2008 was a real turning point for this country. In 2008, we would have the housing crisis and the economic crisis that would result, and 10 million people would lose their homes, and Black and Latino families would lose half their collective wealth overnight. Mm-hmm. We, as a country, would shore up the banks but we left everyday Americans out to dry. And that was the moment it was clear that the neoliberal emperor had no clothes and that we had to have a different economy if we were going to continue to be this society that we think is possible in this country. And so I think we were in a period of transition. This is when you saw Occupy Wall Street hit in 2011. Mm-hmm. You saw the movement for Black Lives. You had Brexit. You had the 2016 primary with candidates that were unlike any candidates who'd come before them. And by that, I mean Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. So it was a period where things that were previously unthinkable were happening, and it cleared signs that a new economic order was emerging. And I am clear that we are at a crossroads in this country. It is not a foregone conclusion we will walk the route of the guarantee economy. I'm merely naming it's possible, and it's something that we've seen start to happen and we can build on. There's a whole other route here that would be choosing a much more authoritarian path. It would still be built on a premise that, the game is rigged and we need a new economy. But it would be much more austere, right? There was a man who ran for president with that statement and won in 2016, and he would preside over the biggest tax breaks for the ultra wealthy and corporations that we've seen in this country. Like right now with the tax code that we still live under, which by the way expires next year. At the end of 2025, you'll see the end of the Trump tax cuts, and that will be a big fight for the future of revenue in this country. But the 39 biggest companies right now pay $0 in federal taxes, and they have a combined profit revenue of $120 billion. So it's significant. It's significant what we're losing out on in this country. So all that to say, despite the story of helping, the everyday human would preside and govern in a very different way. So I think that we are still in a period of transition. It will become clear what route we chose, 50 years when we look back. And so I'm just asking us to do that, to look to the future and say, this is the path that we should choose.
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on this necessarily, but I feel I've heard different arguments for this, and I don't really know where I land with it. So maybe you can convince me otherwise. When the crash happened in 2008, and what were we bleeding out 1 million some jobs a month in early 2009? It was crazy. And yeah, the housing market was bonkers, and all of those things that had happened. I've read a handful of books on this period, and I think a lot of people in Obama's cabinet were really kind of pushing for, because of I think we know now, and I think some people had, I think like, Tim Geithner, maybe other people, of this was bigger than probably a 29 crash. They call it the Great Recession, but it was probably a little bit bigger when all said and done. Wow. But I guess the bit of it was some people were pushing for just straight Keynesian economics. Some people were calling for a complete just kind of government takeover of all these banks. What's the nationalization of banks, and doing that, which has happened for many other countries. I mean, this is kind of the most, very, very left kind of position here. And, I think Obama was less sanguine about doing that for a variety of reasons. And so what ended up happening was these bailouts for these big banks and big companies. And yeah, the Main Street kind of got the short end of the stick there. We did do a pretty big stimulus, not as big as some people wanted. And I don't know. Do you think that there is just something where it was tricky, right? I mean, you had the first Black president, so there's a lot of focus on things, and you don't want to get it wrong, and you also want to get things passed, even with supermajority at the time. And yeah, trying to still be kind of uniting. I mean, do you think that it was? I mean, we don't have to kind of relitigate that part of history, but I don't know. And I kind of hear the arguments for it. I mean, it's like you don't want the market to completely fail and just, give free money to people. You do have to worry about inflation there and things like that. But I don't know. I mean, how do you? And we did do Dodd-Frank, which I think was the policy-wise, the attempt to try and say, okay, we'll give you some things, but we're going to regulate some other things. And we got the, CFPB out of it and all this stuff. I don't know. I mean, how do you feel? I'm going to assume you're going to think that it wasn't enough, that we could have guaranteed a lot more for people at that time, or somewhere along those lines. But how do you feel about this?
Well, we were still operating under a very clear orthodoxy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we've talked about, a story of neoliberalism that tells us how to handle these things. Now, that said, I do think Dodd-Frank was very meaningful, and I'm glad it passed. It was a very hard thing to pass in 2010. I think it's done a lot. I do think I do agree with you. We had to stabilize the country. My point is, you also needed to invest in people. And that was just not what we were doing at the time. And it is a clear difference to what happened during the pandemic of 2021, when we would mobilize the National Guard, right? To just put free.
I wanted to come to this. Yeah.
We would send checks, stimulus checks, and it passed the expanded child tax credit to give every parent in this country a check with no strings attached at all. Mm-hmm. We would send rental support to help keep people in their homes, unemployment insurance. Now, it wasn't all rolled out perfectly, but the danger was government doing too little to help people, not too much. And that was a different story than the one Obama was governing under in 2009 and 2010.
So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to pandemic. But before that, do you think a lot of maybe the way in which, stuff was handled in 2009 and 2010, yes, we got Dodd-Frank. Yes, we had a stimulus. Yes, we had obviously the ACA, but this kind of economic piece of things where, a lot of people did kind of get the short end of the stick, and you saw these bailouts and people didn't like it. Do you think that was on both sides, right? Left and right, a contributing factor to populism, which is kind of what you mentioned earlier, of all the way up to 2016, where we had Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, running on that. I mean, there were many other things too. Immigration was a pretty big issue during 2016, but do you think that 2008-9, but really the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, and then really having both these candidates, especially I think Bernie was pretty involved before it, and then Trump did his version of right-wing populism, starting probably in 2015. Do you think this period and how people felt kind of shortchanged kind of pushed a little bit of where people are at or were at the time in 2016 for looking at populism, whether it's on the right or the left? Do you think that was kind of a contributing factor there?
I do. I think people were clear that it wasn't working for them. And so they wanted something different. And they were going to gravitate toward whoever was telling them something different was possible. And yes, I think that's partly why you see the rise of populist candidates in that period.
So let's fast forward to the pandemic real quick, because just to kind of make a sort of comparison here. So it seems, I mean, a lot of people have said, and I mean, pundits and critics and people that write op-eds and people have written books on this. And when it's all said and done, at least the first 2 years, and maybe you can say first term of Biden, I mean, is kind of a progressive's dream. Like progressives in the U.S. Now, granted, I know it's Uncle Joe, the moderate liberal Democrat, blah blah blah, all these things, but economically, I mean, there's so many things that has happened. I mean, is there anything? Okay, in the current climate, right? You had a crisis again. Unprecedented, overused word, but definitely unprecedented in 100 years for sure. I mean, on all the economic pieces of it, in terms of trying to guarantee, we tried to end childhood poverty, giving checks to people, giving the stimulus, giving people the renters insurance and help. Credit where credit's due. I think Trump's administration started with the CARES Act, and then everything kind of got built on that subsequently during Biden's first year. Even other things like CHIPS and Science Act, and then we had the Inflation Reduction Act. And I mean, is there anything else that could have been done realistically? I mean, people have said that everything Biden did, I mean, there wasn't really a misstep from a progressive stance or even a liberal stance, and that is probably the most progressive since FDR. I mean, even more than LBJ. I mean, is that about right? Is there any like dissatisfaction? Like, man, come on, Joe, you could have really done this or this or this. I don't hear that a lot. Is that about right? Like, he kind of reached realistically. I mean, there's nothing else that could have been done. No.
Well, I think the unfinished business was the care work, the work that was in Build Back Better, which was the big investment in sort of infrastructure of care. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the work still to do. Mm-hmm. And so many of the things also would expire. So there was a big political bet made around the expanded child tax credit, for example, that if we put it for 6 months inside of the American Rescue Plan, then once those checks started coming, you wouldn't be able to turn them off. Well, I think that was misunderstanding how deeply broken the Washington machine is and how much gridlock there is. And frankly, the civil war inside of the Republican Party that would mean, despite being a party who cares deeply about family, they wouldn't, not one of them would show up to vote on, something like the expanded child tax credit, which we know there is actually a lot of support right of center for. So it was a political calculation that was made. But no, I think your bigger point is kind of the point I'm making in the book, that there is a ground floor that has been built of the guarantee economy, proving it's possible in this country. And we see it across homes, the support for building more housing, but also protecting renters and preserving affordable housing that we have. We see it across healthcare, where we've literally seen the lowest number of uninsured Americans at any point in the great economic crisis, despite millions of people being thrown out of work. It's getting us closer to a healthcare guarantee and a very clear role for government in procuring the vaccine, administering the vaccine, and then also, making COVID care free, mailing us tests, right, through the Postal Service. All of that are the types of things Americans are not used to when it comes to healthcare. So, and we go on across each of the guarantees. So including the guarantee of higher education, right? Where billions of dollars of student debt have been canceled, outright canceled. Now, for years, there was a moratorium. So no student debtor had to pay back their debt during the crisis, giving people more breathing room each month. And now we've seen the cancellation of billions of dollars of debt, proving it's possible to get us closer to the guarantee of college. So the floor has been created. And it's important that we build on it. It's also important for people who agree with this worldview to understand that it is just the floor. It's just the beginning. And yes, there's a lot that needs to be improved on, but that is the work that can happen if we believe that it's possible. And that if we elect people who get us there and hold them accountable to do it.
I guess some of the worry here is, the debt is expanding. Granted, that's not Biden's fault. It's been expanding, under everybody. So that's not necessarily Biden's fault. It was true under Trump. It was true under Obama. So that's not a Biden thing, but it is expanding. But it was something on the order of, I'm drawing. Where were we at? We were at, between all of the acts that were done in the first 2 years, billions of dollars that were being sent. And now you could say, well, it's worth it. But some people have contributed some of that to why inflation rose. Not entirely, but that, and why it's been harder to come down. Now it's obviously come down, but then we have price of goods, and we have still issues with the housing market, and we still have many, many issues with the economy where it's fine, but it's not as robust as maybe people would like it to be or whatever. And some of this takes time. But I think sometimes there's a concern that, too much spending is going to lead to certain issues with inflation or interest rates or other things long term. And that could be problematic because, short term, it looks nice and it feels great. But then, we're going to have other issues down the road. I mean, what do you, again, I'm not saying I'm making these claims. I'm just, what do you make of these kinds of challenges to some of the lots of spending? I mean, lots of spending in the first 2 years on great stuff, great things. It's great to do all those things at a time where people needed it. But, balancing things out, what do you make of these challenges?
Well, the way to handle things like the debt is to raise taxes. That is the way we make sure that we are able to pay for what it is that we want to do. And I think that is incumbent upon all of us to recognize that we have the lowest tax rates that we've had in history. And it is not conducive to building a society that where people are able to live lives of dignity, right? We actually need corporations who do very well in this country to pay their fair share in taxes. We need the ultra wealthy who are doing very well in this country, thanks to the guarantees we've discussed, to pay their fair share in taxes. So that's where I would start. That's where any of this conversation, starts. That said, this country always finds money to pay for things this country decides is important, right? Whether it be manufacturing chips right here on U.S. soil because of national security concerns and making sure that we are a leader and competitive, which passed in a bipartisan way, or whether it's building roads and bridges. When we decide it's important, we pay for it. And so the good news is that there is no shortage of ideas of how to do that, sitting on the shelves of think tanks and organizations ready to go. Things like a high frequency trading fee that you would levy that would raise billions of dollars called a financial transaction tax. There are a number of ways to do this. We just have to have the political will to get there. Now, you also brought up inflation, which I think is really important because I do think people are feeling it. I think that is so much of what's behind today's polls. You and I are having this conversation in May of 24, and the polls are such that they say people across every political stripe, young and old, are feeling economically precarious and they want something different. They want a different future. And I think that inflation has a lot to do with that. Inflation is really rooted in this extraordinary supply chain crisis that we had, where we had this coming together of the war in the Ukraine, a supply chain crisis, the COVID opening and shutting down that would create too few goods, right? Inflation is essentially too many dollars chasing too few goods. And it would start to raise prices. We also know that there perhaps were corporations who took advantage of the inflationary moment and went in and made record profits off the backs of everyday Americans. So the answer to that is to do the macro work we know we need to do and that the feds need to do, but also to support families who feel it the most and put money in their pockets. That's the answer to dealing with the rising cost of living. And that's what happened. And if you look at our recovery versus other wealthy nations' recovery, we're actually doing better. And
that's certainly true.
Investment we made.
That is certainly true. I've made this argument to people when I talk to them. Is yes, inflation is not, down to where we want it to be. Of course, people don't think about inflation unless it's a problem, right? People weren't talking about that in, 2017 or 2018. But, when you look at many parts of Europe, granted, it's not, some places it's not terribly high, but some places it still is. There are certain countries in Central Europe and even out when you get further out east. Obviously, Latin America is pretty high in many countries. but even parts of Western Europe as well. It's not maybe 10 or 11%, but it's still maybe a little bit above where we're at, and has been there. So yeah, it's interesting because for whatever reason, this is the kind of the maybe the paradox here. It seems the U.S. dollar does pretty well around the world, right? But here within the United States, not so much, which is a strange thing to think think about. So, if you're traveling, it's okay, it's not so bad. But if you're here in the U.S., it's like, man, it's kind of tough day in and day out, which is just a strange thing. It's a strange thing with obviously goods and supplies, and so this is a thing that's going to continue to be a challenge and a topic of conversation for definitely this year and into next year, regardless if it wins the election in November. But I guess the question I have here is, what's kind of where we're at now with many of these 7 elements of the guarantee framework? So we've kind of sort of traipsed through, the past 12, 13 years from 2011 till now and talked about, pandemic stuff. We talked about stuff during Obama and a little bit of Trump administrations. But, for example, we can just kind of go through some of these quickly. You're absolutely right about student loans. Not my student loans. I still are paying every month, but we'll get there. But student loans have been forgiven. Pretty. I mean, I think Biden has been the best. Hands down, for sure. I mean, he's really forgiven that for a lot of people, which has been really, really helpful for a lot of people. And yeah, obviously ACA in 2010 was tremendous. And even though there were 60 plus attempts at repealing it or whatever it was from, certain Republican in the House and in the Senate, it's still there. And I think the point you make, I think people don't really realize that because it's not an issue anymore or it's not as much in the news, but how much we've covered in terms of Americans with healthcare, and since 2010, and how Biden has continued to extend it and extend a lot of things. Prescription prices, I think, was one of the last big kind of topics that were talked about, which is amazing. Is incredible. I mean, it's incredible, and I work, in healthcare, my day job. So, I kind of see this stuff, and people forget. I think it should be said. I mean, people forget. Some people forget, I think, but the way healthcare was in 2006, 2007, and 2008, we were on a path towards nobody but the richest people in this country being able to afford health. Like, people do not remember that.
That's right.
It was a big, like that. This is part of the reason why, I think, you only get one, maybe 2 issues that you can get kind of, big, comprehensive reform when you're president. And I think maybe for personal reasons too, but I think Obama really kind of saw this. I can't imagine, maybe you can, I can't, what healthcare would look like right now if we didn't have the ACA 12 years or 15 years later. I can't imagine. I think we would have legitimately a massive health crisis. And it's hard to say, right? It's hard to be like, well, we dodged a bullet, or, we avoided that train wreck. And so let's just, pat ourselves on the back for what we avoided. But I think how it's continued to be extended, how many people have health insurance. And then when you look around the world, even for some places like the United Kingdom or other places, it's like there are problems with healthcare in the United States, without a doubt, no question, and there always will be. But again, and this isn't my commercial for American essentialism, but we have made a lot of progress within healthcare and pulling it back from the brink, even despite a pandemic and a crash and all these things. And so that's another big thing. So yeah, education there, healthcare, and there's a lot of other things. Certain places have raised minimum wages, which is good. So yeah, what's the current state of where we see the guarantee? And you can tell us about that, and then we can kind of just see peek into the future of where it could go, where we hope it doesn't go, and other things like that.
Yeah, I just think you're laying it out really beautifully. I think that it was unconceivable that we would forgive billions of dollars of student debt, that was even possible. That was something the government could do.
Right.
To be fair, under Obama, I will often say, like, those ideas would have been laughed out of the room. And now they're Rose Garden events, right? And a Biden administration. To be fair, at that time, we were focused on the for-profit colleges, which were preying on low-income students, on students of color, and charging exorbitant amounts for nefarious degrees. And so there was work. In fact, Kamala Harris, when she was AG of California, would sue one of these for-profit schools and win on behalf of the Corinthian 15. They would close down their operation. It was called Corinthian. And there were 15 students who brought this lawsuit and were sort of in the media. And just were saddled with so much debt. And so there was an emphasis on the for-profit colleges, but now there's this understanding government has a role to play in ensuring that people don't walk around with a ball and chain every month because they did what this country told them they were supposed to do and go get a degree, right? As we're talking, college is at $100,000 in some places in this country, which is unfathomable and out of reach for so many people. And it's a fundamental reflection of college and higher education as a personal investment, as opposed to a public good at a society that is better off if its children are educated and in jobs that are paying well and are meaningful and have purpose. And that is what I think the guarantee of college, is saying. And I think one step is recognizing government has a role and can cancel student debt and can play a role in getting us closer to debt-free college. So I think you're totally right. On the Affordable Care Act, millions of people were thrown out of work overnight in the pandemic. And in America, that meant you also lose your health insurance. Yeah. So it was absolutely a pending disaster. And that didn't happen because the Affordable Care Act was there, because there were actual provisions when we passed it 14 years ago that it will allow Medicaid to expand. And that is just what happened. People rolled on to a health insurance plan, and we saw the lowest number of insured Americans in history. We just saw North Carolina, right, be the 40th state in the union to expand Medicaid. That's happening in blue states, red states, and purple states. All of that was unfathomable during the Tea Party filled angst-filled politics of 2010 when the Affordable Care Act passed. And I think we can look back in hindsight and say there absolutely should have been a public option. It should have sat in the marketplace. And that said, that is in some ways what Medicaid is doing. And there's still, like you say, so much more work to be done. But you're right, the headlines don't get written. Tsunami averted, crisis averted. Right. When government works, it isn't talked about.
We did try the public option. I read some book on this. I can't remember which one it was, but Pelosi gets her flowers on this. I'll give her flowers on this. Everyone, I think it was in December of 2009, and everyone was just like, it's done. It's dead. We tried, we couldn't do it, okay. And she came back after the holidays and said, we got to do this. We got to get it done. And then they went back to the drawing board and they got it all figured out, and they dealt with the Blue Dog Democrats and the Cornhusker kickback and the whole thing. And March, we got it done. So she gets her flowers. She really was a driving force on figuring that out. And she's, she's a political genius, really, to get all the votes and all these things. But we did have a public. We tried it, and I think sometimes you try it one way, and okay, but I think what doesn't get said loudly, which I'm okay with, to be honest, because I don't want to hear the bullshit from the other side. But Medicaid is kind of doing a lot of elements of what we want. Not exactly how we wanted it, but it's doing a lot of that. It's doing a lot of lifting for that, which is a good thing. I think that's I think if at least that's getting done, I don't care what we call it. Expanding Medicaid, fine, or whatever. We don't want to call it a public option, fine, but Yeah, I think I was reading about this maybe about a month or so ago about how much, the ACA keeps getting extended and it keeps getting built on, it keeps getting reformed. And to me, that's the most frustrating thing about the United States. I love my country obviously, but we do a big thing. It takes a lot of work. We got to get everybody's opinion in there, even though, maybe some people's opinion shouldn't be there, but we get everybody's opinion. We finally get something done. It takes forever and we're kind of exhausted. And then we don't do anything with it, right? So, like an example of this is like Social Security was not meant to last 100 years. Like it was not designed in the 30s to be 100 years. We've figured it out, but we do need to kind of upgrade. We do need to figure it out. And I feel like it's the same. We did ACA. That was great. A lot of hard work, a lot of fighting. We got it over the finish line in 2010. We did the whole, this happens in 2010, this happens in 2020, or 2012, this happens in 2014. And dealing with all the blowback and the, attempts to repeal it. And so I'm glad that we keep, tacking onto it, keep building off of it. And I think we just have to get better at that. We have to get better at, we do a big thing and then we keep refining it. We keep sharpening it. We can't just let it go and be like, okay, we don't have to ever touch this again. So to that end, where do you think the future is of the guarantee? Where do you think, regardless of we get 4 more years of Biden or we get for another 4 years of Trump, maybe somebody else, unlikely, but regardless of that, where do you think? Over the next 5 to 10 years, how do you think that framework continues to progress forward?
Well, I wanted to say one more thing on the ACA, which is just underscoring your point that there have been 66. I think it's even bigger.
That's not right.
Attempts to repeal it, legal, legislative. I mean, Donald Trump ran for president on repealing the ACA. He had the House and the Senate. You know what stayed around? The ACA, because it was working in people's lives. And there was still despite the bluster and the rhetoric, they knew that. They knew it was working in people's lives. And to your point, it would have been a crisis without it. And so I just think there are so many stories of persistence and resilience. Once we can get these programs in, then they change people's lives. And, the old joke of seeing protesters out on the street, like, government hands off my Medicare.
Well, you see this with climate change too. It's not, Republicans nationally don't talk about it. A lot of red states, use a lot of clean energy. They do try to have, elements to tackle climate change because they see the effects, right? They see how it impacts, their state or whatever, especially if there's national disasters, things like that, or natural disasters, excuse me. So, yeah, I mean, I think you see this a lot. Maybe not like, yelling into a bullhorn about it, but they do kind of push on that. So I totally agree with you on that. You do see a lot of that. And, credit where credit's due. McCain definitely was huge with that thumbs down vote. That was a real critical point. And I think Roberts saying it was a tax, even though it's not a tax, but whatever. I think, had some help there from the other side as well. So I think that's also, fair play for them. So, but yeah, the future. Where do we see this going?
It's such a good question. Here is what I see. I see people in cities and states across this country building the guarantee. Right? New Mexico just made a constitutional amendment to the right to childcare and made childcare free in the state of New Mexico. My work is on guaranteed income, my day job at the Economic Security Project, where we've been heads down building the guaranteed income work across the country. So I'll tell you briefly about that, which is, about 8 years ago, Mayor Michael Tubbs in Stockton, California, would launch a demonstration of what it meant to send people a check, $500 a month with no strings attached, sent out regularly, and people could count on it. The same thing started happening in Jackson, Mississippi, where Aisha Yandaro was doing this with a program called Magnolia Mothers Trust. And these 2 early pilots of guaranteed income would spread. People would start texting and say, I want that in my city. And my organization worked with both of them. We would open source the playbook. We would invite others in and it would spread. It'd be 20 cities, it'd be 30 cities, 60 cities, counties would start doing it. And now there's 150 pilots around the country where local leaders are showing what the future of a guaranteed income would look like. And so it's an idea whose time has come. And I think, in the pandemic, there'd be an opening and lawmakers would look for ideas that were sitting around, that were tried and tested and true. And this is one. Mayors across the country had been doing this. So they would pass the expanded child tax credit, which if you have 2 small kids is essentially $500 a month with no strings attached. And they would take that playbook and run with it. So it's moved very quickly. And even though we don't have it federally, we don't have an expanded child tax credit federally, that is the work to do. Literally all of the votes are lined up. We've already passed this House of Representatives. We have the votes in the Senate. We need it to be brought to the floor. It's there. Until we have it, though, it is moving forward at the state level. We've doubled the number of states that have child tax credits on the books. And in some states, it is a unanimous vote. Every Democrat, every Republican votes for it. You see purple states, you see red states, you see blue states passing the expanded child tax credit. So I am optimistic for the future because the ground game, right, in the laboratories of democracy, we are seeing movement on the guarantees. Now, it's happening at the same time as so many of our freedoms are being rolled back. And it feels like we're walking backwards on so many issues that many of us care about. And that's, I think, the challenge of this moment is to hold the progress we've made, hold the size of the problems, and fight against the backtracking. It kind of all has to happen at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's, it's encouraging, right? Because it's kind of like how we started where, yes, we want, government to really give that kind of, good baseline, that good foundation for everybody. But you're seeing, regardless of, who's in office or what party or whatever, that, certain communities locally and then at the state level are also saying like, hey, like this does, we see the effects, this does make sense. And I think that for a lot of those things, that's super, super encouraging, right? As we see how things go in the future. Natalie, this was a lot of fun. You are doing fantastic work. Your book is great, and you're very lovely to talk to and to explain all of these really important things that really impact us. So a big thanks for coming on and sharing your wisdom and your insight, and I greatly appreciate it.
It was such a pleasure. You are pulling out arcane political knowledge in a way that I am appreciating so much. So it's really a pleasure to walk around the politics of 2010, 2016, and the politics of tomorrow with you. So thank you.
Absolutely.